Alright guys, so it looks like Saturn is losing its rings, and it's losing its rings at a worst case scenario rate. So is it time to panic? Is it time to run out on the streets naked? Is it time to buy the most expensive telescope you can get your hands on and look into the sky and see Saturn's rings before they disappear? Well, don't panic yet, because even though it's the worst case scenario, Saturn's rings will still be around for millions of years and could be around for at least 100 million, maybe even more. Now, this is the maximum rate estimated from Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 observations made decades ago. So since then, they've been doing further analysis and they've discovered that these rings are getting lost to Saturn itself at a pretty high rate. So what's happening is that Saturn's gravity and Saturn's magnetic field are causing these particles of ice to fall into Saturn. The rings are made of these little particles of ice and dust, and it's the magnetic field and gravity that's causing this rain, they call it, rain of ice, to fall onto Saturn. And these are what the rings are made out of. So this iconic image here of Saturn won't be around forever. Now here's the magnetic field and how it's charging these particles, and it's causing these particles to fall onto the surface of Saturn. There we go. You see this rain of ice. And so these rings, enjoy them while they're still there, guys. So now they estimate that these rings will be here for at least 100 million years, maybe even 300 million years. So they're not sure yet. But we're going to look at more details of these rings. And did you know that all of the outer planets have rings? We'll look at that in a couple of minutes as well. So let's go down here. So we estimate that this ring rain drains an amount of water products that could fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool from Saturn's rings in half an hour, said James O'Donoghue of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. From this alone, the entire ring system would be gone in 300 million years. But if you add this to the Cassini spacecraft measured ring material detected falling into Saturn's equator, and the rings have less than 100 million years to live. So this Cassini measurement combined with this other measurement, so we're looking at between 100 million and 300 million years. This guy was the lead author of a study. Here's a study. So they call it ring rain on Saturn's ionosphere. And here it says the flow rate to the planet is between like about 430 to 2800 kilograms per second. So this is the amount of the rings that's falling to Saturn. It could be almost 3000 kilograms per second. Now this is the lower rate, so there's a pretty high range here, 432 to 2870. So they're really not sure. It's a lot of guesswork right now, but maybe further missions will reduce that range further and we'll get a more accurate prediction. So assuming this continued rate of loss, the rings will be gone in 292 million years. Now I don't know how they came up with this. If this range is so big, how did they come up with this figure? Not sure. I mean, do they know how much mass is in the rings right now? So like I said, Saturn isn't the only planet with rings. Now Saturn's rings are highly visible. The rings on the other gas giants, they're not as visible. Some of them are very faint and thin. So how did Jupiter's rings form? So Jupiter's rings, allegedly, they're formed from dust particles hurled up by micrometeor impacts on Jupiter's inner moons and captured into orbit. And it says if the impacts on the moon were any larger, then the larger dust thrown up would be pulled back down to the moon's surface by gravity. So these particles need to be small, otherwise they'll just fall back down to the respective moons. So these are very fine particles that Jupiter's rings are made out of. So here's an image of the rings here. So the lifetime of dust particles in the ring is from 100 to 1000 years. So the dust must be continuously replenished in the collisions between large bodies with a size of 1 centimeter to half a kilometer. And here's a diagram showing you a meteor impact on one of the small moons, and then the dust gets blown off the moon's surface and it just orbits around Jupiter, but it slowly gets dragged into the planet. So it needs to be replenished all the time from these impacts. So it looks like Jupiter's moons are having these impacts all the time, because otherwise these rings would no longer still exist. Now here is a picture of the rings of Uranus. So Uranus, like Jupiter, has very faint rings. This was taken by Voyager 2. And here we have Neptune's rings, once more taken by Voyager 2, very faint rings. Saturn's rings, they are the jewel in the crown, if you like, of rings of this solar system. And this article is talking about disappearing rings. Now this one isn't talking about the ultimate destruction of the rings. This is talking about the fact that from Earth, our view of the rings changed. So you can see here in 2007, 2008, the angle at which the rings are changes. So here in 2007, you can see the rings more clearly than 2008. Eventually what will happen is you'll just see the edge of the rings from Earth for a period of time before the angle changes again, and then you see it more like this. So the rings were discovered by Galileo peering through a primitive spyglass. He discovered Saturn's rings in 1610. And in 1660, Jean Chapelain argued that Saturn's rings were not solid but made instead of small particles independently orbiting Saturn. His correct suggestion was not widely accepted for nearly 200 years. So I want to talk a little bit about scientific consensus. Look at this. For 200 years, this guy, who was correct, his suggestion was not accepted for nearly 200 years. So for nearly 200 years, the scientific consensus was that the rings of Saturn were solid. Unbelievable. Of course, going back to the original discoverer, Galileo, we had the whole Galileo affair, where Galileo was prosecuted for his support of heliocentrism, the astronomical model in which the Earth and planets revolve around the Sun at the center of the universe. So we know that this is actually the case. The Earth and the planets revolve around the Sun. Now this bit is not correct because our solar system is not at the center of the universe, but the part about the Earth and the planets revolving around the Sun, that is true. But Galileo was prosecuted for this because at the time the belief in the church was that the Earth was the center of the universe and the Sun and the stars and the planets all revolved around the Earth. And for his troubles, Galileo, he was sentenced to formal imprisonment at the pleasure of the Inquisition. On the following day, this was commuted to house arrest, which he remained under for the rest of his life. So guys, when you see scientists even today getting censored and banned and treated like garbage, this has been going on since forever. This is how humans behave. They get into these cults or these tribes of beliefs, and Galileo was a victim of this. Thankfully they didn't murder him, but he was under house arrest for many years. So looking at this Jean Chapelain guy, so he's the guy who claimed that the rings were not solid. It says here that he was a poet and critic. Now interestingly, it doesn't say anything about him being an astronomer. So this is the historical background of Saturn's rings. So 1610, Galileo was the first person to observe the rings. And if we scroll down here, it mentions Jean Chapelain makes the insightful suggestion that Saturn's rings are made up of large, very small satellites. Since most astronomers at the time strongly believed that Saturn's rings was solid, with one notable exception, Cassini, Chapelain's suggestion went mostly unnoticed. It would be another 200 years until Maxwell in 1856 makes a similar deduction. So once again guys, these astronomers, most of them just don't know what they're talking about. For 200 years, the consensus was that the rings were solid. So where do Saturn's rings come from? Scientists have long wondered if Saturn was formed with the rings or if the planet acquired them later in life. The new research favors the latter scenario, indicating that they are unlikely to be older than 100 million years, as it would take that long for the C ring to become what it is today, assuming it was once as dense as the B ring. We are lucky to be around to see Saturn's ring system, which appears to be in the middle of its lifetime. However, if rings are temporary, perhaps we just missed out on seeing giant ring systems of Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune, which only have thin ringlets today. So that's a good point. We could be around at a good time to see Saturn's rings, but we may have already missed out on these 3 other planets with their rings. Who knows? Various theories are being proposed for the rings' origin. If the planet got them later in life, the rings could have formed when small icy moons in orbit around Saturn collided, perhaps because their orbits were perturbed by a gravitational tug from a passing asteroid or comet. So here they're hypothesizing that the rings came from collisions between small moons that collided. Saturn has a lot of small moons. It's got over 80 satellites. It's got a few big moons, a lot of small ones. And it does kind of make sense that some of these moons might have collided and formed the rings. But it is interesting that they do suspect it's not older than 100 million years. Now, I don't know how they came to this conclusion, but if it is true, then the total lifespan of these rings may be 200 million years to maybe 500 million years. And apparently Saturn was formed about 4.6 billion years ago. So there you go, guys. The rings are disappearing. Enjoy them while they still last. Remember, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, comment. Let us know what you think. Do you think it'll be a tragedy when the rings disappear? Or is it like, meh, whatever? Let me know in the comments. See you guys next time.